On August 28th, 1887, the wind came down from the high country with a dry, rasping edge that tasted of stone, and by sunset the thermometer nailed outside the depot office stood at 43 degrees, too cold for that late in summer and wrong in a way old hands noticed but did not name. Cold Water, Wyoming Territory, sat along a rail spur like a wager made in haste, one main street of pine boards and fresh paint, two cross lanes of ruts and alkali dust, and a ring of shacks, sheds, and pride stretched thin across open ground. At the depot, she saw a freight clerk's tally sheet that put the town at 347 souls that week, counting teamsters sleeping in wagons and miners between claims. Men on the platform talked about weather the way men talked about debt and luck, as if custom would carry them through another season. Wade had seen enough country to distrust that tone. Wade Holloway arrived that same evening behind two mules hitched to a narrow freight wagon, whose left wheel still bore a bent iron band from the South Pass Road. She was 32 years old, broad-shouldered from years of lifting feed and timber, with wind-burned cheeks and hands marked by lime and rope. She wore no mourning ribbon, no black veil, no ornament that asked for pity. Before daylight the next morning, a teamster at the pump asked if she was the widow from the shale descent, and by breakfast a woman at the baker's door offered condolences she had not requested. Elias Holloway, her husband, had died 11 days earlier when their wagon overturned on a shale descent and pinned him beneath the axle before help could reach him. She came west with his field notebooks wrapped in oilcloth, a lockbox containing $93 in mixed coin and notes, a roll of hand tools, seed packets, and one knowledge chain she treated not as memory but as law. That law had passed through Elias's mother, Lisa Holloway by marriage and Lettinen by birth, who had grown up in Finnish winter country where rivers sealed hard enough to carry loaded sleds and night could split green over snow while livestock froze standing if shelter failed. Liza had taught both her son and Wade the same doctrine in exact order. Never trust a mild autumn, never store grain where thaw water can touch it, never build for comfort when survival is required, and never treat earth as dirt when earth can be wall, roof, and heat bank together. She had shown them how a chamber sunk below frost line could hold near 55 degrees with proper vents and packed mass, even when outside air turned murderous. She had demonstrated with numbers scratched in charcoal on barn plank and with labor measured in blisters. Elias learned beside Wade, not above her. When Lisa died of fever 3 winters before, they kept her notebooks and her methods both. Grief did not make Wade theatrical. It made her exact. On the road into Cold Water, she counted remaining nails, weighed each flour sack by hand, and wrote distances on the inside cover of Elias's ledger as though precision itself were a form of prayer. At dawn on August 29th, she fed the mules, checked hoof cracks with rendered tallow, and walked the town perimeter before the store doors opened, pausing where runoff cut the church wash and where the ground rose into a stony half-acre that most buyers had already passed over because plow blades sparked against buried rock. Stony land held shape. Loose land slumped and drowned sellers. She asked price, not opinion. Silas Pemberton gave both. He owned the largest general store on Main, supplied nails, kerosene, wool, tinned peaches, and most of the credit that kept poorer households upright between paydays. He was 47, full in the face and belly from steady profit. His beard trimmed square, his boots polished even in dust season, his black broadcloth coat brushed daily by a clerk who slept in the back room. Gold watch chain, heavy signet ring, fresh collar in town where laundry water came dear. Prosperity sat on him like armor. His voice reached from store porch to hitching rail, and Wade watched men pause when he spoke. When she inquired about lime, barrel staves, and iron vent collars rather than curtains or crockery, He watched her in silence long enough to gather listeners, then said she would find cold water kinder if she stopped preparing for disasters that did not exist. By September 3rd, she had bought the stony half-acre beyond the wash for $12 in cash, entered cleanly in the recorder book, and begun work before sunrise with a spade, a mattock, and 2 hired daymen, paid $1.25 each for 10 hours. She paced a rectangle 32 feet by 18 on the long axis east to west, then marked 3 linked chambers branching off a central corridor, wide enough for 2 loaded sled trays. The first chamber she dug to 7 feet depth for sleeping bunks and stove mass. The second she cut lower for food pits and sealed barrels. The third she reserved for animals in crisis, with a sloped drain trench and plank floor above gravel. She calculated spoil volume and set spoil by purpose, fine earth for sealing, coarse stone for retaining edges, and flat slabs for step treads. She did not rush. She repeated measurements. As her excavation deepened, wagons slowed at the lane and drivers leaned to stare. By the end of the first week, she had set timber ribs at 3-foot intervals using salvaged pine stringers from a dismantled freight shed, each rib notched and wedged into sidewalls tamped with damp clay. Over the ribs, she laid willow lattice, then sod blocks cut 12 inches thick and 18 inches long, green side down, seams staggered like brickwork to resist settling. She left 2 vent shafts, each lined with clay flue tile fired in a shallow pit kiln behind the site. Intake on the north side at ground level, exhaust rising higher on the south, with capped hoods turned from sheet iron to shed drift. She mixed sealing mud at a ratio Elias had written from Lisa's instruction. 3 barrows clay, 1 barrow sand, chopped horsehair enough to bind, then water until it held to the trowel without slumping. She paid 30 cents for each tile, $6 for lime, 90 cents for a keg of cut nails, and another $1 for tarred rope that would later run as a guideline to the nearest wells. Silas Pemberton came out from his store porch on the 8th of September, while freight crates were being unloaded, and surveyed the trench with a merchant's smile that never reached his eyes. He called to the men within Wade's hearing, loud enough for teamsters and church deacons and laundry women carrying baskets from the creek, and named the project the Badger's Burrow. He described it as a widow's panic dug into the earth, a hole for fear, a place where sunlight died. By supper, Wade heard the phrase from 2 different mouths at the pump. On Sunday, passing church steps without stopping, she heard it again with a snort and a laugh. Children traced claw marks in dust beside her lane and laughed when she walked by. A clerk drew a badger on scrap paper and pinned it by the coffee barrel where she saw it while buying salt. The mockery settled into routine before the week turned. Wade neither argued nor withdrew. She paid for supplies in cash, hauled water in paired buckets, and taught the daymen to tamp wall lifts in 6-inch courses so the earth mass would cure without cracking. She lined 2 food pits with cedar slats set on stone blocks to keep sacks above damp, drove iron hooks into rib posts for lanterns, and fitted each chamber with double plank doors, separated by a 4-foot airlock passage to reduce heat loss when opened in storm. She drove stake markers from hatch to wash and from hatch toward the reed well line, then measured 20-yard intervals where lantern posts would stand once snows came. At dusk, she copied each step into Elias's notebook under a new title in her own hand. Cold Water Plan, September's 1887. For one household, expandable by need. By the second week of September, the burrow had taken form not as a whole but as a system, low and deliberate, ugly to eyes that favored painted facades and visible prosperity, beautiful only in the strict mathematics of endurance. Men pausing at her fence line told each other they had never seen snow and cold water above porch height. At Silas's counter, she heard women balancing grocery credit repeat that panic purchased poor theology and worse commerce. Wade kept setting stone, sealing joints and counting sacks. At noon, she checked the wind. At dusk, she checked the sky. In the evenings, when the lane emptied and lanterns lit along Main, she stood by the unfinished hatch with mud to her elbows and listened to geese crossing higher than usual in a hard, fast line toward the south. The geese passed until they were only black strokes against a paling strip of western light, and Wade remained by the hatch long enough to hear the night settle into the wash, sharp and metallic, as if every fence wire in Coldwater had been tightened by an unseen hand. At dawn on September the 17th, she rode her mules to Willow Creek and found the beaver work banked high and tight with fresh mud above the usual line, not a summer repair but a winter wall built in haste, and she stood in the frost-hardened grass with Elias's notebook open on her palm while her breath came white in air that had no right to feel so cold that early. The depot thermometer showed 29 degrees before sunrise, then climbed to 50 by noon, then fell again with a speed that made carpenters rub their hands and mutter. Weather on the high plains could turn without warning. Old settlers knew this. Yet there was a difference between ordinary turn and predatory turn, and Wade had been taught to recognize it. She returned by way of the Reed place and saw Thomas Reed carrying kindling from a split pile, his jacket too thin at the elbows, his two younger sisters tying rag strips around a broken pail handle near the door. The mother, Ann Reed, asked after the excavation with the cautious courtesy of a woman who had no extra money and no interest in offending the merchant who held her account book. Wade answered plainly that she was increasing stores and sealing vents before October. Ann Reed nodded without agreement, and Thomas watched Wade's wagon longer than children usually watched passing teams. By that evening, word had spread that the widow had gone to inspect beaver dams like a trapper. On the 18th of September, she stood outside the church after the final hymn, hat in her hands, and asked for 5 minutes while families gathered at the steps. There was no theatrical alarm in her voice. She gave dates, measurements, and supply counts. She said an early killing winter could close rail delivery by October if snow struck before bridge repair east of Cheyenne, and she urged each household to lay in 30 days of grain, lamp oil, and split pine, with water casks filled and kindling kept dry under cover. She advised double-door windbreaks and rope lines between house and well at fixed intervals no greater than 25 yards. She offered to show anyone how to cut sod blocks and seal seams with clay and hair. Silas Pemberton waited until she finished, then stepped down from the church steps with his gloves tucked into his belt and his voice pitched for the crowd. He said, weather fear was poor theology and worse commerce, that providence did not require burrowing, and that any respectable family could take confidence from proper fuel and proper credit at his counter. He announced a fresh allotment of imported coal at $14 per ton, nearly double the summer price, and added that panic buying would only punish the prudent. Men laughed in relief because laughter was cheaper than uncertainty, and women who owed for calico and flour looked at one another and said little. Wade did not answer him there. She turned, crossed the yard, and went back to work. 3 days later, the survey rider came in, mud-stiff from the East Road with delayed telegraph notice copied by hand at Rollins, reporting that the timber trestle beyond Cheyenne had failed under freight load and that flour consignments were held until repairs could be staged. The message did not predict duration. It did not promise dates. It merely confirmed interruption. Silas pinned the notice inside his store where only customers at the far counter would read it, then assured anyone who asked that normal autumn would hold and new wagons would come through before serious weather. Credit slips multiplied. Cash purchases thinned. Wade bought salt pork, lime, lamp wicks, and barley in measured lots, paying coin on the nailhead, and carried each item to her half-acre without comment. By the 4th week of September, the town's judgment had become a social instrument, not merely idle talk. Silas spoke with 2 councilmen after supper. and a clerk delivered written notice that Wade was to appear regarding unsafe excavation near the lane. The hearing took place in the back room of the Mercantile with 4 chairs, 1 cracked ledger desk, and a stove that smoked when the wind shifted. The charge held no engineering language, no clear measure of setback distance, and no witness to actual collapse hazard. It functioned as warning. She was fined $2. She counted out the coins, asked for a receipt, and returned to the borough before dusk. There was no speech. There was no plea. Her answer was labor. By 27th of September, she had raised the internal sod walls to 12 inches thickness along all 3 chambers, with timber ribs at 3-foot intervals checked by plumbline and cross-braced where grain weight would rest through winter. She laid a second run of willow lattice over the animal chamber roof and added packed subsoil above the first course until cover depth reached 18 inches at the crown, enough mass to hold stable temperature through ordinary freezes. The airlock doors were rehung with leather washers, cut from an old harness to reduce rattling gaps. She fired additional clay flue sleeves in a trench kiln at low heat for 7 hours, then cured them slowly beneath blankets so they would not crack in sudden cooling. Each sleeve cost her 28 cents in material and fuel, when broken down by ledger line, cheaper than freight tile, and less likely to fail because she could inspect every piece herself. In the food chamber, she built raised cedar slats on stone feet, 6 inches off grade, and set oat sacks in paired rows with an aisle wide enough for a hand sled. She preserved 47 quarts of turnips and beans, 6 jars of rendered fat, and 3 small kegs of vinegar brine, each container dated in pencil and wrapped in scrap cloth to damp temperature swings. She packed potatoes in dry sand to keep them from sprouting if a thaw came midwinter, and she hung cured pork from iron hooks where airflow stayed steady. Against the north wall, she stacked split pine to shoulder height, then left an inspection gap to watch for rot. Waste was not acceptable. Guesswork was worse. Near the hatch, she drove 6 lantern posts along the first rope guide toward the wash and 5 more on the line toward the reed well, setting each post 3 feet deep with tamped gravel and a collar of frozen clay to resist heave. The rope itself was tarred hemp, thumb thick, sunk shallow where wheels might cross and lifted chest-high near drift-prone turns, so gloved hands could find it in whiteout. She tied knot markers every 20 yards, 1 knot for approach to intersection, 2 knots for hazard, 3 knots for hatch entry. The system appeared severe and ungainly in calm weather. In blinding snow, it would become map, rail, and lifeline in one object. On October 2nd, Thomas Reed arrived with a parcel of nails from his mother and a message delivered in the careless voice of boys sent to carry adult cruelty. He said Silas had asked whether the badger planned to hibernate alone or invite moles from the wash. Wade took the parcel, set it on a barrel, and told Thomas he could keep the insult if he wished, but should take the instructions. She wrote on a single folded sheet, "What to do when you cannot see your own door." She listed 12 rules in clear block hand, beginning with tie line from bedpost to door latch before nightfall, and ending with never walk for help alone. She told him to nail the sheet beside the stove where smoke could not reach it. Thomas folded the paper twice and placed it inside his shirt. One evening late that week, after the mules were fed and the last mud seam smoothed, Wade stood alone in the entry passage with Elias's notebook open to Lisa's pages and spoke aloud in Finnish, not for comfort but for discipline, reciting vent ratios and fuel intervals as if she were reporting to the dead and to the living in equal measure. Fear was present. It did not govern. She closed the book, checked the draft at both flues with a lamp flame, and marked in pencil that the north intake pulled true under rising wind. By October 9th, daytime temperature fell from 51 to 19 degrees within 48 hours. A windless afternoon followed, strangely mild in appearance. the sky pale and calm above roofs newly crusted with old frost. Men in town called it proof that the widow had misread signs. Silas announced a harvest supper with fiddle music and hot coffee, and from the porch he joked that Wade had dug herself a widow's grave with shelves. Lamps burned late along Main while families laughed too loudly and stamped mud from their boots. At sunset, Wade walked the full rope line one final time, gloved hands sliding over knots, lantern hooks, and post tops, then checked each hatch hinge, each barrel bung, each coal scuttle, each blanket roll laid in reserve for souls who had not yet asked for help. Over the western ridge, the color drained quickly, and the sky turned from pewter to iron with a hard edge that left no room for argument. By full dark, the first snow began, fine as sifted flour, moving sideways. The first snow traced thin white lines along fence rails and vanished on contact with the still warm ground. But Wade did not read the light fall as comfort. She set both mules under canvas windbreak, checked their water pails for skim ice, and ran her hand along each rope guide from hatch to wash in the dark, testing knot, spacing by touch, alone. Inside the entry passage, she trimmed lamp wicks to an even 1/4 inch, measured draft pull at the intake with a strip of linen, and adjusted the flue baffle 1 finger width to keep smoke rise steady under crosswind. She banked coals in the small stove chamber with split pine and 1 shovel of coal fines, then closed the inner door and stood listening until the burn settled to a low, even breath through clay throat and iron collar. By dawn on October 10th, the snow crust had hardened over wagon tracks, and the depot thermometer read 14 degrees in clear morning light. Main Street moved as if the prior evening had been an inconvenience rather than warning. Freight hands scraped steps, women beat rugs against porch rails, and Silas Pemberton's clerk chalked new prices on a board by the store entrance, with coal now listed at $16 per ton and lamp oil up another 2 cents a quart. Wade crossed that street once, paid cash for 2 sacks of barley and a coil of lighter hemp line, and ignored the way voices dipped as she passed. Back at the Burro, she widened the second chamber aisle by 6 inches, so 2 loaded hand trays could pass without tipping, then drove fresh pegs for blanket racks where rescued souls might hang wet wool to dry above floor frost. The project grew by increments that looked small to anyone counting days, and enormous to anyone counting survivable nights. She built a 3rd vent exchange in the animal chamber by laying brickbats in a staggered throat, creating a slow heat sink that would warm incoming air before it reached bedding level. She dug a sump pit at the Cardar low point, lined it with stone chips and char, and covered it with removable slats so spill water would drain away from grain. She split cedar poles to make sleeping berths in 2 tiers, each berth 24 inches wide, and packed mattress ticks with dry grass, sealed in ticking cloth against damp. She marked wall heights in charcoal every 6 inches to monitor settling, and added 2 diagonal braces where the north rib had shifted a thumb breadth after freeze. At noon, she boiled kettle after kettle and poured hot water over door hinges, then worked bear grease into the pins so they would not seize when true cold came. 3 days after the first sideways snow, the town found a new tone for ridicule, less theatrical and more punitive. Families who had once offered stiff nods now stepped around Wade at the pump as if caution itself were contagious. The seamstress on Willow Lane returned Wade's mending bundle untouched, saying she had no wish to sew for the woman who predicted ruin at every prayer meeting. 2 hired men who had previously cut sod for her sent word that Silas had extended their store credit and advised them not to be seen deepening unsafe pits on church approach land. Even the council clerk, who had written her receipt without comment in September, informed her that a second inspection might be necessary if neighbors complained of drift eddies near the lane. Wade listened, asked what distance measure the council proposed, and received no answer that involved numbers. Silas sharpened the public script from his own porch, where prosperity still framed him in polished boots and dark cloth, while most of Coldwater patched elbows and repinned cuffs. He said in hearing of teamsters that panic had now become enterprise, that some souls would sell fear by the cubic yard if others would buy it by the shovel. When a miner asked whether the borough could house the whole county, Silas replied that it might house badgers and prophets, but not respectable householders who trusted wood frame and Christian weather. Laughter came quickly and died quickly. Men needed his ledger. Women needed his flour bins. No one challenged him while the shelves behind him remained full. Wade answered none of it in public. Her reply was a ledger of labor. She added a second hatch ladder with staggered rungs, so gloved boots could descend safely when snow packed the first opening. She wrapped each barrel bung with waxed cloth and twine, then painted symbols in lamp black on the barrel heads for fast reading in low light. Grain, salt, dried beans, rendered fat, vinegar, clean water. She built a hand-washing station from a nail keg and tin spigot near the airlock to control sickness if crowding came, and she cut pine strips into tally sticks to track ration draws by household rather than by appetite. On the 11th of October, she hammered tin reflectors behind corridor lamps to double usable light and conserve oil. By evening, she had assembled 4 rescue sled trays from scrap planks and bent iron runners, each tray narrow enough for 1 adult or 2 children wrapped together in quilts, each with rope loops fore and aft for paired pullers. The dismissals around her became organized enough to resemble policy. A notice appeared on the church door, warning against unauthorized alarm, unsigned but copied in the hand of the council clerk. At supper tables, the nickname, "The Badger's Burrow," traveled as moral shorthand, not merely insult, but accusation, as if preparing for hard weather proved disloyal to neighbors who still hoped prices and seasons would behave. Boys chalked claw marks on her outer hatch stones. Someone loosened 2 lantern posts along the wash line during the night, and Wade found them at dawn leaning 40 degrees, rope sagging into drift trough. She reset both posts, tamped gravel hard, and added buried anchor stones that would take an hour to pry loose even with tools. When Thomas Reed passed on his way from the well, he watched her work, then walked on without repeating the jokes he had carried weeks before. By the second week of October, the warning signs multiplied from scattered curiosities into a coherent pattern that could only be ignored by choice. Smoke from cook stoves no longer climbed in clean columns at dawn, but flattened and ran low along roofs, pressed by a high inversion that trapped cold close to the ground. The moon on October 11th wore a wide pale ring that held until midnight, and by first light horses in open pens stood rump to wind with ears pinned, refusing feed until late morning. At Willow Creek, frazzle ice formed in narrow tongues along edges, even as midday sun touched 50 degrees in sheltered spots. A split behavior Elias had once recorded as a prelude to rapid collapse. Wade cut 1 sample of creek edge ice and held it to light. Bubbles, tight and layered, frozen from sudden, repeated chills rather than one steady freeze. She rode to 3 outlying places that afternoon and spoke without flourish. At the Boone cabin, she advised clearing stovepipe elbows and setting lamp bases in sand pans. At the Voss shed, she advised tying rope from door to woodpile and from woodpile to privy before dark. At Ann Reed's house, she handed over 2 extra wick rolls, a bag of dry kindling wrapped in oilcloth, and a second copy of the 12 rules Thomas had pinned by their stove. Ann Reed asked in a low voice whether it was truly coming hard. Wade said it was, and said the sentence as one might state depth at a river crossing, not to frighten but to keep others from stepping blind. She asked whether the Reed door opened inward or out. Ann answered inward. Wade nodded once and told Thomas to keep a shovel beside the hearth, not by the porch. That evening, with a brittle sunset fading over Coldwater, Silas hosted another gathering in the mercantile back room to steady trade. Coffee was served in thick mugs. Fiddles played two quick reels, and talk rose louder each hour in the manner of towns attempting to drown arithmetic with fellowship. Silas raised his cup and declared the cold snap already broken by noon warmth, then announced a special extension of credit for flour and coal through month's end, provided accounts remained current on spring debts. Men thanked him because they believed they had been offered safety. The terms bound them tighter than rope. Wade stood at the threshold only long enough to buy 3 pounds of nails and 1 roll of canvas. Silas called after her that burrows were for animals and bank vaults for men. She turned, met his eyes, and answered in a level voice that words did not keep out the wind. Then she stepped back into the dark. Overnight, the wind shifted north and held. The temperature at sunrise on October 12th was 9 degrees, and by noon the light had gone from gold to a flat tin color that erased distance across open ground. Wade spent those hours in final conversion of private shelter to communal refuge. She moved her own bedding to the smallest berth and gave the wider, lower bunks to expected arrivals. She posted simple rules at the entry in charcoal on plain board. Remove wet outer layers, warm slowly, drink before sleep, no open flame beyond marked line, never leave alone. She set 2 iron kettles on trivet stands and filled both from sealed water casks. She split kindling to hand length, stacked it in 3 stations, and placed flint tins in each. In the food chamber, she opened 1 barrel of oats and 1 of beans ahead, of need so frozen lids would not cost minutes later. Late in the afternoon, Thomas came running with his cap in both hands, breath burning white. Not panicked, but urgent in the disciplined way Wade had seen in freight crews when brakes failed on grade. He said the depot agent had just posted a second relay note. No repair crews had reached the eastern trestle, and 2 expected flour wagons had turned back at drifts west of Cheyenne. He said his mother had sent him to ask whether the rope line toward their well remained in place if dark weather came. Wade told him it remained, told him to return directly, and walked him to the first lantern post so he would memorize distance by step and knot. She made him repeat the count aloud twice, then sent him home with a shovel, 2 candles, and instructions to keep boots by the stove through supper. An hour later, she finished the last outside task she dared attempt. She fixed a red cloth strip to the hatch post at shoulder height for orientation in whiteout, checked mule halters in the animal chamber, and closed the outer gate against a wind that had begun to strike in hard, intermittent blows from the north. Across town, lamps were being lit one by one behind thin plank walls and curtains. In Silas Pemberton's window, the glass reflected bright shelves and hanging scales, still arranged as if ordinary commerce would arbitrate what weather did next. Wade sealed the airlock, laid her palm against the packed earth wall until she felt its stored warmth answering back, and listened as snow thickened from whisper to force. Snow hit the hatch in hard lateral sheets within the hour, each gust striking with a force that made the timber braces answer in a low, continuous groan. And by the time the depot clock rang 7 that evening, the lane markers nearest Main Street had already vanished beneath a smooth, rising drift. Wade kept 1 hand on the inner latch and 1 on the flue baffle wheel, listening to the draft deepen as wind speed climbed. At 8, she opened the outer door only long enough to read the nearest lantern through blowing white. The flame bent flat, recovered, and bent again, and she judged gusts above 50 miles per hour. At 9, the intake pipe carried a fine powder into the corridor despite its hood, and she tied doubled cloth over the grate to slow intrusion without choking flow. Outside, Coldwater's plank houses began to fail in the ways thin structures always failed, not through spectacle but through accumulation. Hinges froze, stovepipes iced, roof seams lifted, and doors that opened outward, packed shut under drift weight no shovel could clear from inside. By midnight on the 12th of October, temperature at the depot instrument had fallen to minus 11 degrees, and the reading at dawn, taken by the agent through a cracked window with frost on his beard, stood at minus 27. The wind did not relent with darkness. It strengthened. Snow crossed the town in horizontal bands, dense enough to erase a lantern at 10 paces. The church bell rope froze stiff inside its belfry housing. 2 freight wagons left near the rail spur disappeared to axle depth and then to wheel top. A team of cattle broke fence and turned downwind as one body, then lodged against the lee wall of the schoolhouse, where they stood with ice along their flanks until men cut them free at noon. Silas Pemberton kept his mercantile door barred and traded through a shutter gap with gloved hands and strict voice, charging $18 per ton for coal, now damp from repeated door openings, $2 above his own chalkboard from 2 days earlier, and requiring immediate ledger marks for flour that he had not yet unloaded from rear storage. Desperation reached him as opportunity, even while weather was stripping opportunity from everyone else. Inside the burrow, Wade converted every prepared measure to active use. She lit both flues, moved the mules to the rear animal chamber where heat held most steadily, and marked ration boundaries in chalk on a wall plank, so no allocation would drift under pressure. She boiled the first kettle before sunrise and kept water near simmer all day, rotating iron pots to preserve fuel. Every 30 minutes she checked vent pull with a lamp flame and recorded draw strength against outside noise in Elias's notebook. When a gust dropped, she opened the airlock and cleared drift from the hatch throat with 3 shovel strokes, then sealed again. She worked methodically, but the method itself had changed. This was no longer preparation. This was operation. Shortly after first light on October 13th, pounding came through the outer hatch. Not a knuckle pattern, but a frantic hammering with frozen hands. Wade opened the first door against packed snow and found Thomas Reed bent forward in the trench, a rope looped around his chest, and 2 smaller figures tied behind him under feed sacks, stiff with ice. His eyebrows were white with frost, his lips blue at the edge, and his voice came in broken bursts as he said, his mother could not move their door, that smoke was backing into the room, that the girls had started coughing in their sleep. Wade pulled all 3 into the airlock, cut the rope with her belt knife, and set them on the warm side bench without speech until breathing slowed. She stripped the wet outer sacks, wrapped the girls in wool from her reserve rack, and held warm tin cups to their hands before letting them drink. Thomas tried to stand and point back toward town. Wade pressed him down with one palm and told him he would walk only after heat returned to his fingers. By noon that day, the burrow had received 11 souls. The 3 Reeds, an elderly couple from the wash lane, 2 rail hands from a drifted bunkhouse, Ann Boone carrying her daughter Eliza wrapped in quilts, and a miner named Caleb Sorn with a wrist swollen from forcing a doorframe. Wade assigned berths by vulnerability, not by status, set 1 lantern at each chamber junction, and imposed rules in a voice that invited no argument. Wet clothes hung on the rack line, boots lined near the inner wall, toes toward heat, never against stovestone. No one slept alone near an exit. No one stepped outside without rope tied to waist and second hand on guideline. She handed Thomas a shovel and gave him charge of hatch clearing in 10-minute intervals with mandatory warming breaks, then gave Ann Reed the kettle rotation and tally sticks. The shelter became a small government under weather siege, and it worked because every task had already been imagined before anyone else believed imagining necessary. 3 days earlier, Silas had stood in polished boots and declared himself steward of sensible commerce. By late October the 13th, his storefront looked like a stranded vessel. Snow sealed the lower windows to sill height. The signboard cracked at one chain and struck the wall in each gust. Customers no longer queued at his porch because there was no porch visible to queue upon. He sold through the second-story loading hatch by rope basket until the basket line iced and snapped. His clerk, Ezra Vale, attempted to carry 2 sacks of cornmeal from rear shed to main room and lost one in the drift trough between buildings, where it split and vanished under blowing powder before he could retrieve it. Coal stacked in side bins took wet through warped plank seams and froze in clumps too large for common grates. Shelves that had once represented power emptied in uneven stripes. Lamp oil went first, then flour, then salt pork. By evening, only canned peaches, 2 bolts of muslin, and a crate of cracked crockery remained in open view. The authority of abundance had been reduced to inventory fragments and a locked cash drawer. Wind intensified through the second night with a violence that remade familiar distances into hazards. A 10-yard crossing became an expedition. The guide rope Wade had sunk toward the reed well disappeared beneath drifts in 2 sections, but the chest-high spans near turns remained reachable by sweeping hand, exactly as designed. She sent paired teams at intervals she could sustain, 1 puller ahead, 1 rear anchor, sled tray between. They moved out in darkness lit only by hooded lanterns and returned by knot count and muscle memory, hauling 1 adult at a time or 2, children wrapped together, never improvising beyond rules. The weather was not wind anymore. It was a weapon striking from every side at once, and those rules were the difference between rescue and disappearance. On October 14th, in the fiercest cycle of the storm, Coldwater paid its irretrievable cost. Martha Klein, the schoolteacher who kept attendance with immaculate script and had stayed behind to bank the school stove for children's return, was found seated upright by her iron heater after her chimney iced shut and smoke had driven her to open the wrong draft. Her gloved hand still rested on the attendance ledger. The date line ruled but not filled. Jacob Voss, railroad brakeman and sole support for his widowed mother on Copper Lane, tied a sack of flour across his back and attempted the 50-yard run from Depot Storehouse to her door at dawn lull. He was located by noon along the rail fence, 1 hand still on the sack knot, his body turned toward home. Eliza Boone, 7 years old, was confirmed later by Church Ledger report after Ann Boone gave names from the storm hours. The child had taken smoke in the cabin crush before reaching safer shelter. By nightfall, 3 names had entered the town's winter ledger in lines no correction could erase. The suffering in the hours around those deaths stripped away social fictions faster than any sermon. Men who had laughed at the borough now stood in its corridor, passing water cups with shaking hands. Women who had avoided Wade at the pump now held lanterns for her while she rewrapped frostbitten fingers and checked pupils for smoke injury. Children slept in tiers under coats that belonged to other households because ownership had ceased to matter inside earth walls that held at 54 to 56 degrees, while the outside air remained far below 0. The contrast was mathematical and merciless. In plank houses, fire went out and rooms collapsed toward the outdoor temperature in hours. In packed earth chambers with controlled venting, heat loss stayed slow enough to survive the long dark between fuel feeds. Wade did not explain this as theory. She pointed to the wall, to the thermometer, to the dry grain barrels, and then sent the next team out. At mid-afternoon, a rope signal came from the Main Street direction. 3 hard tugs, then 1, the distress pattern Wade had set on the first day. Caleb Sorn and Thomas reached the outer post and found Ezra Vale half buried, face wrapped in a scarf, shouting that Pemberton House roof beams were bowing and that Silas's son was trapped under a fallen porch rail. Wade did not ask who had mocked, who had paid, who had withheld. She gathered the strongest 4 adults able to walk, tied them in 2 pairs, loaded 1 sled with blankets and a pry bar, and took lead position on the line herself. Drift reached her waist in open sections. Twice the front pair went down when gusts hit broadside, and twice she hauled them up by harness ring and reset heading by knot count. At Pemberton's Lane, they found the porch roof canted, one support post broken at the base, and snow pouring through the gap into the entry hall. Silas knelt in that doorway bareheaded, coat gone, one arm around his son, the other gripping a small ledger chest as if account books could still secure his life. Wade ordered the chest lashed to the sled behind the boy, not discarded because balance mattered and argument wasted heat. She cut canvas from her own wagon cover, wrapped the child first, then Silas, then Ezra, and set them in sequence on the return line with rear anchors locked at each drift ridge. Silas spoke only once on the haul back, voice hoarse from cold and smoke, repeating the name he had coined in ridicule as though naming the place might keep the place real long enough to reach it. The Badger's Burrow. The words came not as laughter now, but as plea. Wade gave no answer. She kept the rope taut and moved them forward one knot at a time. By evening of the third day, 71 continuous hours after the first full-force strike, 119 souls were inside the linked chambers, corridor, and airlock annexes, rationed by tally stick and warmed by earth, labor, and rule. Outside, Coldwater remained a field of whitened angles where fences and roofs merged into one hard surface under a dark, racing sky. Inside, lantern light held steady. The walls held, and because they held, Wade could turn from mere endurance to instruction while the storm still battered the hatch. She set Thomas Reed beside the tally board and made him read each mark aloud before handing out oats, beans, and water, so that even a 13-year-old understood how quickly generous fear could empty a barrel. She showed Ann Reed how to rotate wet wool from the inner rack to the outer rack every 2 hours to prevent freezing at the seams, and she showed Caleb Sorn how to clear flue mouths with a bent iron rod without cracking the clay collars. When a rail hand reached for a second blanket for his shoulders, she gave it to him, then pointed to a shivering child on the upper berth and explained the order of warmth. Youngest first, then injured, then those who labored outside, then everyone else by turn. There was no argument after that. Scarcity had a grammar in the burrow, and every soul learned to speak it. By dawn on October the 15th, the gusts had dropped below 40 miles per hour, still dangerous but no longer annihilating, and Wade began the first daylight instruction walks beyond the hatch. She tied groups in pairs on the rope line and made them stop at each knot marker to recite what it meant. 1 knot meant crossing, 2 meant hazard, 3 meant shelter, she sent them out and back with empty sleds first, then with split pine from half-buried stacks, then with casks from the wash lane, each run measured, repeated, and corrected. Silas Pemberton moved in those lines as quietly as any laborer, his fine hands blistering under borrowed mittens while he hauled the same sled he had once mocked as panic gear. His son, Edwin, kept near Thomas, and the 2 boys carried lanterns at dusk without speaking of the porch collapse that had nearly taken one of them. Inside the mercantile, failure had become arithmetic. Coal bought high and sold higher sat frozen in useless clumps. Credit ledgers were thick with signatures and thin with payment prospects. Flour bins were scraped bare. The expensive confidence Silas had sold through September had lasted 3 days against real winter. Wade's chambers, built with $12 of poor land, $6 of lime, 90 cents of nails, and labor no one had respected, had carried 119 souls through 71 hours of blizzard conditions, with temperatures plunging well below zero. No speech could compete with that ratio. 3 days passed before the telegraph rider reached Coldwater again, wrapped in canvas and carrying 2 relay notes in an oilskin tube. The Eastern Trestle repair was underway. Limited flour freight would resume westbound by October 24th if weather held. Wade read the notice at the depot wall, then copied the dates into Elias's notebook beneath her storm entries. External promises had failed once. She would not plan on trust alone again. She returned to the burrow and began reducing emergency rations in measured increments, while teaching households how to transfer from communal stores back to private kitchens without waste. She sent each family home with a written list of minimum reserves: 14 days of grain, 7 days of split pine indoors, 2 sealed water casks, 1 rope line fixed before first snow. She charged no fee. She accepted no gift beyond labor on burial detail and lane clearing. On October 22nd, with temperatures rising to 26 degrees by noon and drifts cut back enough to reopen the church lane, Coldwater held the meeting everyone had delayed and dreaded. The benches were full. The stove burned hot with green wood that smoked at each draft. 3 black ribbons hung from the front rail for Martha Klein, Jacob Voss, and Eliza Boone, and their names were spoken before any account book opened. Wade stood along the side wall, not at the front, her coat still patched with canvas from rescue work. Silas Pemberton came without his broadcloth coat ornaments, without watch chain, without clerk at his shoulder. He carried the ledger chest Wade had ordered tied to the sled and set it on the communion table as if laying down a burden he had mistaken for authority. He spoke in a voice roughened by cold and public shame, and he did not soften his own record. He said he had called her work the Badger's Burrow to make prudent labor look ridiculous. He said he had raised coal from $14 to $16, then to $18, while families were already choosing between heat and debt. He said he had assured the town that weather fear was bad commerce because he feared, above all, losing control of commerce. He named each decision and looked at the households it had harmed. He acknowledged that his son was alive because Wade Holloway crossed a whiteout for him while his own door failed. When he finished, he unlocked the chest and turned it so all could see the ledgers, then asked the council clerk to enter his resignation from the council seat and his transfer of winter inventory to a cooperative ration board under church custody until freight resumed. No one applauded. This was not that kind of meeting. Ann Boone stood next, one hand on the pew end to keep herself steady, and said that pride had made neighbors choose silence when warning might have saved time, fuel, and perhaps one child's lungs. Ezra Vale admitted he had relayed mockery as policy and had looked away when prices climbed past fairness. 2 councilmen who had voted Wade's fine asked for the receipt copy and tore it in half before the congregation, then asked the recorder to strike the amount from her file and return $2 from municipal funds by week's end. Thomas Reed, who had once carried Silas's joke down the lane, walked to the front with Wade's first instruction sheet, edges smoked dark from weeks by his stove, and read every line aloud to the room that had laughed when he first folded it into his shirt. When the confessions turned toward Wade in language of forgiveness, she did not step forward immediately. She waited until Martha's sister had finished weeping into her gloves and Jacob Voss's mother had sat again with both hands clasped over her son's cap. Then she moved to the aisle and spoke with the same measured cadence she had used outside church on the 18th of September. Only now, every head in Coldwater was bent toward her words. She said that 3 graves were fresh, and forgiveness was not a receipt to stamp and file by sundown. She said their mockery had cost more than her pride, because mockery delayed preparation in homes where children slept. She said she would not pretend those weeks had been harmless. Then she set down the harder gift. She said her husband, Elias, and his mother, Lisa, had taught her that knowledge kept to oneself became vanity, and vanity fed no one in winter. She did not build the burrow for revenge. She built it because weather did not negotiate with opinion. If Coldwater wanted to honor the dead, it would do so in labor, measurements, shared stores, and October drills, not in speeches alone. She would teach any household that attended with tools in hand. She would teach those who mocked loudest first, because they had the most to unlearn. The church remained quiet long after she finished. At last, Reverend Cobb, who had stood beside Silas during the September dismissal, asked what must be done before the next freeze. Wade answered with a list and assigned names before anyone could retreat into abstraction. Silas and Ezra would inventory remaining mercantile stock by lantern count and weight, then transfer flour, beans, oil, and salt to cooperative custody with open books posted weekly on the church door. Caleb Sorn and the rail hands would cut sod blocks after first thaw and train 2 crews in interlocked wall courses. Ann Reed and Martha's sister would oversee communal wick and cloth reserves, with records kept in duplicate at church and depot. Thomas and Edwin would maintain rope lines from school, church, depot, and wash, checking knot markers every Saturday from September through December. The council would fund iron flue collars at cost for households unable to pay, beginning with Jacob Voss's mother and the Boone cabin. By the first week of November, the town's language had begun to shift in small but irreversible ways. Children still said burro when racing the lane, but now they said it with direction rather than derision, as in, follow the burro line to the well, and do not step beyond the burro posts after dusk. Silas opened his store under cooperative charter with posted prices fixed by a 3-household board and signed each morning by 1 merchant, 1 laborer, and 1 widow. He sold coal at a margin narrow enough to survive and wide enough to restock, and when accounts came due, he accepted labor on public shelters as partial payment. The old watch chain stayed in a drawer. The black broadcloth coat appeared only on Sundays. Years passed, and cold water changed by inches, then by custom, then by memory. Through the winter of 1888, 30 households built earth-bermed cellars with vent pairs copied from Wade's drawings. By 1891, every lane between church, school, mercantile, and wash had fixed rope posts with knot codes taught to children before penmanship. By 1894, the town census listed 412 souls, and the recorder noted that no winter since 1887 had found a household without at least 10 days of sealed grain in reserve. Thomas Reed grew into the work as naturally as he had once grown into his father's old coat, and by 1897, he led October drills with a whistle, 2 lanterns, and the same 12 rules he had carried home as a boy. Wade remained in Coldwater, not as an emblem but as a worker whose authority rested on repeated competence. She repaired flues, corrected bad vent angles, inspected grain pits, and sat through cooperative meetings where disputes over weight and fairness were settled line by line. On the anniversary week each October, she visited the 3 graves with fresh pine boughs, then returned to teach another class on sealed storage and drift pressure against outward swinging doors. She never asked anyone to repeat an apology. She asked them to bring a shovel and measure twice. The first chamber above Willow Creek still stands. The lintel carries words cut deep by Thomas and Edwin in the summer of 1890, sharpened again by younger hands each decade, so weather cannot erase them. Pride spends quickly. Preparation feeds souls. In Coldwater now, when a new roof goes up with extra bracing, when a cellar is dug below frost line, when rope posts are reset before first snow, old and young use one phrase without irony. They call it building like Holloway. They called it building like Holloway. And by the first Monday after that phrase settled into common speech, Wade required the phrase to earn its meaning in public work, rather than admiration. The church bell rang at 6 in the morning on November the 4th, 1887, and 32 souls gathered at the mercantile with scales, slate boards, and empty sacks. Snow still lay in dirty ridges along the shaded side of Main Street, and the air held that metallic edge Wade had warned of in September, though the sky above was clear. Silas stood behind the counter where he had once dictated price from height and polish, now with sleeves rolled and ink on his fingers, reading each line item aloud while Ann Reed and Caleb Sorn weighed and verified. 23 sacks of flour remained fit for use. 9 were damp at the corners and were marked for immediate baking. 4 kegs of lamp oil were sound. 1 keg had cracked near the hoop and was entered as loss. Coal clumps frozen from seep were broken apart with mauls and graded by size, then sold at fixed cooperative rate posted on the door for all to see. The ledger chest he had clutched in the drift became the cooperative archive, and Wade insisted that every transfer bear 3 signatures, 1 from trade, 1 from labor, and 1 from a household that carried debt. That same afternoon, Reverend Cobb carried the 2 municipal dollars from Wade's unlawful fine in a cloth envelope and placed it on her workbench by the hatch. He said the council vote to return the money had been unanimous. Then he hesitated in a silence that once would have been filled with moral instruction. Wade waited. He admitted that he had stood beside Silas during the church dismissal, had said nothing while mockery replaced duty, and had watched Ann Boone leave with Eliza without offering to inspect their lamp base. He asked whether the returned coins should go to her or to the burial fund. Wade split the envelope in his presence. $1 to Jacob Voss's mother for winter wood, $1 to the school for a covered ash bucket, and 2 sandpans so no lamp would stand unguarded on plank again. He wrote the disposition in the parish book. That thread closed in ink. 3 days passed before the eastern freight finally arrived, with patched trestle timbers and delayed flour consignments stacked behind crates of nails and stovepipe. The depot agent posted the rail notice in full, including the cause of delay and the date of restoration, because Wade had argued that partial information had already cost the town too much. At sunset, she copied the notice into Elias's notebook beside her own storm entries and handed the book to Thomas Reed to read aloud by lantern light in the schoolhouse. He stumbled once over the engineering terms and began again until each child could repeat the chain of events from bridge failure to empty shelves. False confidence became a taught hazard, not a memory softened by embarrassment. On October 12, 1888, 1 year to the day after the blizzard struck, Coldwater held its first full winter drill in clear weather with a high of 21 degrees. Wade placed children at the front of each line and adults behind, forcing the old hierarchy to reverse where pride had once prevented learning. Thomas called knot counts at each post. Edwin Pemberton carried the red cloth marker from Wade's original hatch and tied it at the new school shelter entrance. Ann Boone, who had not spoken more than necessary through the first winter after Eliza's death, supervised lamp checks and corrected grown men when wicks sat too high. Silas inspected door swings with a carpenter's gauge and marked every outward opening entry for immediate rebuild. When he reached his own porch, he removed the hinges himself and rehung the door inward before dusk. Not every reckoning came with speech. Some came by repetition under watchful eyes. Yet speech came as well, in narrower places where witnesses could not dilute it. One evening in late January, after a week of hard cold that drove thermometers below -30 at dawn, Silas walked to the burrow with no coat ornaments and no clerk, carrying a wrapped parcel. He found Wade trimming flue draft at the intake hood, while mule breath steamed in the rear chamber. He set the parcel on the bench and opened it. The badger sketch once pinned by his coffee bowl, flattened and preserved between ledger sheets. He said he had kept it because it represented power when he believed power meant naming another soul smaller. He asked what should be done with it. Wade studied the paper, then told him to nail it inside the cooperative storeroom door, beside the posted prices, not as spectacle but as warning of how fast contempt can masquerade as certainty. He did so the next morning. New clerks were required to read the story before taking the till. By spring thaw of 1889, Wade had resolved the final private store of memories she had carried since August. She brought Elias's oilcloth-wrapped notebooks, Lisa's ratio pages, and her own cold-water ledgers to the school where Martha Klein had once taught penmanship. Martha's sister, now appointed winter instructor, copied each page by hand into 3 bound volumes titled Cold-Water Winter Manual, with measurements, cost, failure notes, and the names of those lost. 1 copy stayed in the school. 1 went to the depot office beside weather logs. 1 remained in the burrow in a cedar box above floor damp. The originals were sealed in waxed cloth and placed in the church archive with a statement signed by Wade that knowledge belonged to use, not inheritance alone. Some souls never offered apology. 2 councilmen who had laughed loudest at the harvest supper, performed every assigned drill, and never again spoke the old nickname. Yet they did not step forward in words. Wade noted this without dramatics and kept teaching them anyhow. In her accounting, changed behavior counted as one form of confession, though not the only one. By October 1890, the lintel inscription above the first chamber was cut and sharpened in public view. Thomas held the chisel first, Edwin struck the mallet, and Wade corrected letter depth so winter frost would not split the strokes. Pride spends quickly. Preparation feeds souls. Children traced the carved words with mittened fingers while older hands set new rope posts toward the wash. The metallic ring in evening air, the moon halo, the flattened smoke, the high beaver dams, the early geese, all signs once mocked as widow fear, entered the annual lesson sheet at the school and were tested each September before arithmetic exams. Distinctive details became doctrine. On October 6, 1894, a freight family bound north misjudged the weather and reached Coldwater at dusk as a white squall erased the lane. Their lead horse balked at the bridge rut, and 1 wagon wheel cracked. Thomas, now a young man with shoulders broadened by rail work, saw the signal lantern from the depot and triggered the drill without waiting for council vote. Rope teams moved. Shelter doors opened. The family of 5, 2 hired hands and 3 team horses were brought into earth-bermed chambers built by households that once resisted every shovel stroke. No one in that rescue asked who had warned first 7 years earlier. They acted within a shared system, which was the point. Wade aged in the plain frontier manner, through labor rather than retreat. Her hair silvered at the temples. Her hands thickened at the knuckles. She still checked vent draw with a lamp flame and still corrected sloppy grain storage with the same unsparing precision she had used on the first day. Each 14th of October, she visited 3 graves with pine boughs and stood in silence long enough for the wind to settle in the grass before returning to whatever work remained unfinished. When asked directly for forgiveness, she gave the answer she had forged in that church meeting and never cheapened afterward. Sorrow had to become practice, or it dissolved into performance. The chamber above Willow Creek still stands, earth-packed and low against weather, its walls keeping near 55 degrees while winters continue their indifferent mathematics. The cooperative books in Silas's old chest remain open to inspection. The badger sketch remains nailed inside the storeroom door, edges darkened, its insult transformed into civic memory. Children in Coldwater still learn knot counts before penmanship, door swing before decoration, reserves before credit. They still call it building like Holloway, and in that phrase mockery never returns, only measure, duty, and the hard generosity that kept a town of 347 souls from spending pride at the price of their lives.